Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont and also the chair of Farm to Plate's Food Cycle Community of Practice, or Food Cycle Coalition, as some of you may know us who have been involved for longer. We've been having a hard time letting go of the Food Cycle Coalition language. So today I'm just going to give, I wasn't really sure who might show up in the room, so I thought I'd just give a really brief overview of the Food Cycle Community of Practice and what we do. And then really today's meeting is to talk about on-farm composting and the new rules and the work that the Food Cycle Community of Practice has accomplished in the last number of months, and what we're asking for right now in terms of some feedback and input from you all on our work. So just very briefly, in terms of the Food Cycle Coalition itself, I included our vision and mission statements here. You guys can read that if you'd like. It's also on the website. But really, we think about and tackle issues that relate to the entire Vermont food recovery hierarchy. So in the past, we've focused in on source separation and waste reduction, the charitable food system, and how do we get edible food into, to our hungry neighbors and people in our communities, food for animals, on-farm composting or on-farm uses. And then there's the composting and anaerobic digestion and energy recovery. And since I've been involved, to one degree or another, we have had conversations and done field trips that sort of touch on all of these different tiers. And so it just sort of depends on who is engaging in the group and who brings topics forward. And my role as chair is really to steward those conversations and create opportunities for participation driven by folks who are engaging. Similar to last year's plan of work, for those who have been involved, we're hoping to provide a mix of in-person and virtual learning and sharing opportunities. The in-person meetings will likely be field trips to see practices in action. If anyone I would just invite has ideas, we're still putting the 2024 details of the 2024 plan together. So feel free to reach out to me directly if there's some place that you've been hoping for an opportunity to visit, or a practice that you'd like to see in action to further your understanding and learning. And then we also host a number of virtual meetings to share updates among our members, to bring in experts to learn about specific topics. And so again, here is a way for folks to get more involved if you're so inclined. Today, I just thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit of a recap of the Food Cycle Community of Practices engagement around the on-farm composting topic, which sort of provides a little bit of a backdrop for the work that we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. So from I guess really in 2019, a couple Food Cycle Coalition members brought up this idea of, and we're really interested in digging into on-farm primary composting, but primarily food scrap composting, really thinking about Act 148, the Universal Recycling Law, and our statewide goals for diverting organic materials and food scraps from the landfill. And then how do you get this done in a state? In some more populated areas, that's a little bit more straightforward, perhaps. In some rural areas, there's farms tend to be thought of as a resource that could potentially be an outlet for receiving and managing some of these some of the diversion goals for our state. And so we started with a composting survey of a bunch of farmers. And one of the things that we heard pretty loud and clear was there was a bit of tension between I'm a farmer, I'm not a solid waste manager, and I don't want to be a solid waste facility, and sort of some tension there between agriculture and solid waste, and which resides in the Agency of Natural Resources, which is where the rules around food scrap composting reside still currently. And then also just a lot of confusion around the regulatory parameters that they would be operating in. And so with a whole bunch of partners, led by Kat Buxton of Grow More Waste Less. I don't know if she's on today, but she's been involved in a lot of this work. We put out in 2022 this Partnering Farms and Communities Regulatory and Startup Guide. And that is available on the vtfoodcycle.com, which is the Food Cycle Coalition's website, where there's a lot of resources. And while we were doing this, Act 41 passed in 2021, which of course, writing a regulatory guide in a ever-shifting landscape of rules and regulations is challenging. But Act 41 is amended the definition of farming, and the required within Act 250 and the required agricultural practices rule to include allowing farms to bring into their farm up to 2,000 cubic yards per year of food residuals or food processing residuals. And so that's in addition to whatever they were already generating on their farm and potentially managing in terms of manure or field residue, other organic materials. There's also a clause in Act 41 that says that provided the compost is principally used on the farm where it is produced, or the compost is produced on a small poultry farm. And there's a whole long different history around poultry farmers and compost grazing of poultry that we're not going to get into immediately today, or at least into like the whole long history behind that, but we can answer questions if there are any. And so with Act 41, we thought that the rules originally around on-farm composting, food residuals and food processing residuals would be standalone rules. And a draft was sort of lightly circulated. And then we learned that that wasn't going to be the case at all. And they kind of did a, like timeout. And we learned that at one of the sessions at the VORS is the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, which the Composting Association of Vermont co-organizes with the Agency of Natural Resources most years. And that was a recorded session. So anyone who wants to dig into some of that history, you're welcome to check that out. But that's where we learned that these rules would be integrated into the required agricultural practices, and that that work would be led by the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division. But because it's within the scope of the required agricultural practices, that also now brings in Water Quality Division and the Non-Sewage Waste Program. And so now there's all these kinds of players engaged in this work to one degree or another within the agency. And so that became, in some ways, a slightly more complicated situation within which to move this work forward. And so the Food Cycle Coalition sort of following this, and I will say as well, as part of the Protect Our Soils Coalition, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, I'm happy to share information about that later in this meeting if there are questions. We'd been following this and sort of engaging in this. And then within the Food Cycle Coalition and within the Protect Our Soils Coalition, we decided it was a good time to sort of take a beat. A couple years had passed. Like, let's revisit our primary questions. Like, where is Vermont with on-farm composting? Where do we want to be as a state? What are the interests of farmers to potentially manage these resources? And then importantly, how can the food cycle best support this practice within our broader community of practice? And there was a large concern about the emphasis within the RAPs on waste and waste management over thinking about food scraps as a nutrient resource. And so we started tackling some of that as well. This led to sort of a flurry of work. We held near weekly meetings for the last quarter of 2023. And it really ended up being a core group of folks working on sort of a mocked up version of the required agricultural practices that with, clearly highlighting what we thought needed to be added and where we thought things could be changed. And in some cases where we just had questions still about what a particular section of that rule was trying to accomplish. And importantly, in terms of being now at the point of requesting input from a broader community, we're really seeing this mocked up version of the RAP rules as a communication tool with the Agency of Agriculture. And so I don't want to give the impression that, what you're going to be looking at in this document is like, the ag folks haven't even necessarily seen or heard about all of this. And so this isn't going to be these aren't draft rules from the agency. These are recommendations from within the Food Cycle Coalition that we're hoping you all will give us feedback on. And then sort of parallel to that, I've also been working on building a more robust relationship through a number of conversations with the Agency of Agriculture folks, and actually bringing them out to see different scales and different types of on-farm composting systems. Because one of the things that I found early was that there was a very narrow idea of what on-farm composting looked like. And I felt that the folks making the rules or, proposing the rules within the Agency of Agriculture really needed to broaden their perspective on what this practice looks like. So that is where we're at. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of that, or to provide more nuance or more details. But where we're at today, and I wanted to just go over the systems that we've set up for collecting input to see if you think they'll work for you. I'm proposing that we try to collect our feedback within the next month or so, about 4 weeks. It's nice to have a deadline. If it's too open-ended, it's hard for people to then make it a priority to actually return to and look over. But we'd really like to collect as much input and support as possible and ask that you share it widely. And I'm going to talk about what's going to happen after that. But first, I wanted to just minimize this and show you some of the systems that we put in place to see if you all have any questions or concerns or suggestions of how to do it better. So we created this pretty simple, short Google form. The document itself is a shared Google document. And for those of you who may be familiar with Google Documents, there are often people commenting or making edits as anonymous. And we felt that it would be really helpful for us to understand who was making comments so we could put it in context or follow up with the person to say like, oh, I'm not sure I am understanding this, or, provide have more conversation around specific points. And then as well, it will be helpful for us when we present this and have meetings with the Agency of Agriculture people to be able to say 52 people looked this over. There were farmers, and there were people who work with farmers, and there were people who visit farmers and want to engage with their farms and their local communities. And so it's not just Natasha handing something off and them not having context. And so this was the best system that I could come up with. And if anyone has ideas of how else to do it, there's still time for that. We're asking just for your name and address. And if you want to provide an affiliation or tell us sort of how you relate to this topic, that's very welcome and helpful. And then that will give you access to this document, which is our mocked up version of the RAPs. This document is publicly viewable. Anyone with the link can look at it and look at the comments and edits, but not engage with this document directly unless you've been filled out the form and been given access to be a commenter. I've tried to add some tips on page 1 of just clearly highlighted in yellow and underlined as text we're proposing be added to the rules. Proposed deletions are highlighted in yellow with strike through. And then there were a couple things that I really felt were important just to have people, if you have limited time and you want to just jump to a specific piece, that's very welcome. And these are the 2 things that we would most want input on, I think. But there you'll see yellow highlighting throughout the document for sure. And then I also just wanted to highlight that there is a table of contents that you can jump directly to different sections of the required agricultural practices. by clicking on it and then clicking on this blue hyperlink section. And so that is essentially what it is. So if you wanted to just look at the on-farm composting rules, you could just jump there and see in yellow what we've added. I've tried to put in little prompts where there are still some things. Carolyn Gordon worked with me extensively on this. And I just want to let Carolyn know that you had a comment in there that I think was more directed at the Agency of Ag folks. And so I left it in here, and that's a nice example of how this can really be an effective, hopefully an effective communication tool in terms of having some dialogue with the agency folks. Carolyn was one of the real core people that people came and went through the 3 months that we had these regular meetings, but Carolyn was really from rural Vermont, was my mainstay, and we did a lot of this editing together. Any questions or anything to add?
It's too easy, Natasha.
So what comes next is that I am planning just to keep this document as user-friendly as possible. I'll clean up typos if people put them in, and non-substantive word smithing suggestions if I feel like it adds clarity. But I will be leaving anything that might warrant more discussion or conversation within this group. They're clearly identified, and as well as comments and questions that you all can add, if you have any. And then Dave Huber is the Deputy Director of the Public Health and Agriculture Resource Management Division, and he's been working closely with Zach Schakowsky, who is an Agricultural Resource Management Specialist. Those are sort of my 2 point people on this work within the Agency of Agriculture. And so I'll be going over this with them and then also facilitating conversations with them. And so I would imagine in March and April, potentially organizing Zoom meetings to have that conversation and communication with the agency so they understand where some of our recommendations are coming from, or they can say, oh, I understand what you mean here, but we can't really do this because water quality or whatever those nuances are. And then ultimately this will lead to formal rulemaking, which is required by Act 41, and is then that's the process that the Agency of Agriculture owns, and there will be a public comment period. I will say that I feel that I've developed a good working relationship with both Dave and Zach, and that they've been very committed to the process and are very interested in working and engaging with the food cycle community of practice on this to better inform themselves and hear from practitioners, farmers, people doing this in the field about what do they need to understand more about? What are the assumptions that they're potentially making that may not hold true in your experience or my experience? Or how can we make these as robust rules as and really functional rules as possible? And they've been really committed to the process. And even though they're a bit behind per Act 41 on the actual rulemaking, I've really appreciated them taking the time to educate themselves and engage with me and others and the Food Cycle Coalition community more broadly on this to try to be as informed as they can as they enter their own rulemaking process. So that was sort of what I wanted to cover. Yeah, Kelly.
Yeah, and I know you and I have talked about this in conversation, but looking at some of the language, it can feel, if you're not an expert or somebody that's worked in this field extensively, it can feel a little bit overwhelming in terms of the jargon, or perhaps there's, language that we're not all familiar with. And I think more than anything, it's helpful to have feedback, and that can come from lived experience. And so don't feel as though if you start to review the draft that Natasha and others have been working on, don't feel as though you have to have all the information we're looking for any feedback because we'll certainly take that into account and be able to move forward from there. So I think that's, important to relay. You don't have to be an expert in order to provide feedback on this document. Your feedback is welcome as a farmer, a practitioner, a member of the community that is interested in these topics. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Kelly, for folding that in really explicitly. And I just wanted to jump back and also say that if there are things that just don't make sense to you, like totally fair to, and please flag that. And one of the things that you'll see is that we actually have added a lot of definitions, or we're proposing that a number of definitions are added to provide some of that clarity and just make some things that we felt were assumptions within the RAPs a little bit more explicit. And so if there are other definitions, or if there's something that's referred to that you're reading that you just don't even know what it's really about or why it's there, please bring that up as well. And you'll see actually one of the comments I left was I got down to agricultural inputs, and I was like, I just made up a new term. Didn't make up a new term, but I proposed adding a new term, nutrient resources, that might be what they meant by agricultural inputs, but I hadn't, so I would just like flag that, like, if this is what this is, let's define it. Let's be explicit about what we're talking about so we're all on the same page. Any other questions or concerns? Does a month feel like an adequate amount of time to provide feedback? I see some heads shaking yes. The other thing I wanted to just flag is that anyway, and if anyone knows Google better than me, please let me know. I could not find a way to automate, like to connect the form to giving permission to edit the Google document. But I was able to set it up to send me an email every time someone fills out the form. And so I'm just going to be putting people's emails in, but that means that it's not instantaneous access. So if you fill out the form at 10 at night, you won't just automatically have access to that document until I add your email in. And I spent a bit of time trying to figure out how to connect those dots in a more direct way, but couldn't figure that out. So that's just a heads up that it's not just immediate access. Yeah, Carolyn.
Natasha, I'm just wondering, since seems like we still have a little bit of time on this call, if it would be helpful to go a little deeper into the edits we've been working on, just to talk it through a little bit more in detail. Maybe that will spark some questions or discussion, or just give people more the feeling that they have a grasp on some of that substance we've added there to the existing RAPs.
We can certainly do that. The other just sort of system thing I wanted to remember to say is that Kelly Dolan is going to put a link to the form and to this document on the Food Cycle Coalition page and the Farm to Plate. And we're going to be circulating that through as many listservs and bulletin boards and direct people and coalition members as we can. And so hopefully soon there will be just a page that you can send people to, but we are really hoping to have as robust input as possible. And I'm actually going to go up here because I wanted to jump back to just one thing that I highlighted. And this connects back to a number of conversations that have happened within the food cycle community of practice over the years. It's this whole concept of waste versus resource. And agricultural waste, and manure is a waste. And if things are not well managed, they can become a problem. They can cause water quality concerns for sure. But we still, like every time, and I saw Robert Foster's head nodding, right? Every time it comes up with farmers, they're like, this is like a valuable resource on my farm, and I'm going to manage it to utilize it and to harness those nutrients. And so This is one section that I'm not sure if the Agency of Agriculture folks will embrace it, but I think it's a conversation worthy of having. And so we tried to tease apart waste from resources in the definition of agricultural waste in the RAPs. And we made sort of parallel nutrient resources, nutrient management systems, and nutrient storage facility. And in the current RAPs, there's agricultural waste management systems, and agricultural waste storage facilities. And this is one area where I'm not in, like, I feel like input would be great. I feel like, we've moved that ball a little bit, and we essentially are saying that waste is something that cannot be adequately managed on a farm, but needs to be moved off the farm, right? So in the RAPs, in the definition, you'll see manure is mixed in with heavy metals and plastic, right? Like it's like these are not the same. And so this is also just a good example of and reminder that these are just recommendations and conversation starters with the Agency of Agriculture folks, but not necessarily, like, we're not necessarily going to see them through rulemaking, I would say. So just to be clear that I'm not promising, I don't want to give the impression that we have any more input, any more control over this than we do. This is really providing input and trying to encourage folks making the rules to think about these in a more system-wise and resource-informed way. Carolyn.
Yeah, along that same vein, I think the other side track that the other rabbit hole we explored taking was also to write in soil health practices into the RAPs. This is already an NRCS practice standard, but not part of the required agricultural practices rule, but something our Protect Our Soils coalition's been advocating for some time, and also in other coalitions we're engaged with at rural Vermont, where it's subject, that is kind of the discourse, where would something like soil health principles best fit in our current framework. And so this is kind of, speaking of conversation starter, the conversation starter, whether this existing section of soil health management lends itself pretty nicely to just reference what's already a federal standard and to adopt it in our state rule.
Related to that, healthy soil is actually defined in Act 64 in statute already, and that was not in the definitions for the RAPs. And so we added that in the definition and referenced, made the appropriate reference there as well. And again, so feedback or input could be questions about our wording or why why certain things made its way in here. It could also be like, oh, I think about, soil armor is this. This is a better way or better example to fold in. So, wordsmithing, things that are missed, things that are unclear, or if you feel that we've inadvertently added more confusion in our attempt to provide clarity in a certain section. All of those kinds of things, really full gambit. I will say that in the definitions, the numbering, because we added in some much, and I made a comment in there, like, don't worry about like the numbering and things, right? This is not the final version. So you can just if there's some crazy typo, or if you're just that kind of person that catches typos, feel free, but don't worry too much about some of that, because this is not like the ultimate version that's gonna move forward anywhere. I know sometimes things like that can be distracting for some folks.
Let's look at section 6, since that's really the beef, or what makes beef.
609.
So I think what we're looking at is basically that existing original language of the RAPs that's already in existence for food processing residuals. So everything that's not highlighted yellow here was there before. And we're thinking here, if you stay a little bit up, Natasha, still,
Okay.
you see we're thinking to strike out this language around less than 1,000 cubic yards. That was the limit of importing food processing residuals, basically making the assumption that now that for food residuals, the limit is 2,000 cubic yards a year, that the agency will go and par to make that also the new limit for food processing residuals that can be imported on a farm per year. So that's kind of the first thing. And more than 42 cubic yards is in there because the law kind of had this provision that says the rules should be equal to or better than the A&R rules. And the A&R rules for composting food residuals, they start at 42 cubic yards. So they have an exempt category for composting up to 41 cubic yards. So we think we will also have that exempt tier from the RAPs equal to the existing A&R rules.
Yep. And then another nuance, and this is led very much by the Composting Association of Vermont's work with farms. We're proposing, and we changed this in the definitions as well, not talking about compost facilities, which makes it sound like this great big thing. I just had Dave and Zach out at Firefly Farm, and they have a 3-bin system, and their bins are 6x6, right? Like that is not a facility. And so helping broaden the perception both from the agency and regulator side, but also helping farmers see themselves in this potentially felt really important. And, you know, a pad and bunkers and permanent structures are not necessarily required for all scales or all types of on-farm composting. And so, that's just that's the kind of thinking that went into some of these edits, I guess, would, you know, might be helpful to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see what else is in there. And then, yeah, maybe here we wanted to also acknowledge we took out the language around distances from property lines and other buildings, because we will have a discourse with the agency about what this equal to or better rule really means, that we have to comply with these rules. And we're thinking a concentrated development where the goal is to keep the agricultural field free from development. That's really what we want to go for. And we don't want to just adopt these numeric distances that were kind of in here unquestioned, and discovered that for many sites, it's probably going to be preferable in agriculture to do the compost operation like close to the road and near to the buildings that already exist, so that you concentrate that development and soil compaction on your farm.
The other thing here is to just highlight that most towns have zoning around this as well. And so this is sort of another layer that, you know, where these numbers come from, I'm not sure makes sense. And on the smaller scale or the community farm scale, like 200 feet from a property line might mean that a particular farm can't compost at all, even if it's a small scale, well-managed situation. And so we thought that this seemed a bit too prescriptive, knowing that there are other setbacks and guidelines in play anyway.
And it's also something where we know there's openness within the staff of the agency to discuss this, the option for variance on that, and where it's reasonable to interpret the equal to or better standard, that a solution like that would be satisfying that, because it would be at least equal to the standard of A&R in terms of how it would play out for the environment or public health. So we're hopeful that we can have a good discourse around that.
And folks, jump in or raise your hand if you do have questions or want us to pause more, but hopefully it's helpful focusing on this section and just highlighting some of our thinking and the changes. And Carolyn, I'm gonna let you keep going with some of this.
Sure. So small c is basically directly from statute. The committees didn't want farms that are
kind of urban farms to start being compost operations too, just out of the fear of nuisance, even though in the making of the law, we were able to provide through public record request information that there wasn't too many nuisance issues associated with this kind of practice in the past, but yet this was kind of the compromise that we don't want this, or we can't really have this within downtown village center, new town centers, um,
Unless
unless it's
expressly allowed.
yeah, unless expressly allowed. So towns can opt into that if they choose to. But that's the barrier on that. And then little d, so this is also directly from statute, but I think when we go further down, if I remember correctly, we expanded it a little bit. So basically also here that kind of same standard needs to be managed in a way that it's reducing odor, noise vectors, and other nuisance conditions. Also from statute, just clarifying here, you don't need a solid waste permit. That's the reference to 10 VSA and small 2. And then on this new page, and this is kind of where we're now foraging ahead. I think this is kind of the core piece for input, a suggestion of best management practices for this composting of food residuals or food residuals on food processing residuals on a farm. And that's kind of small 1, only source separated materials. So here's where we adopt what's the universal recycling law standard around source separation, basically making sure that farms are not accepting loads that are obviously contaminated, and the remaining practice will go deeper into that. So small e, the second point here is like there has to be a system to hold howlers and customers accountable to comply with the food source separation requirement, whatever that system may be. That's not prescriptive, just there has to be some system in place. And that also will include that when there's someone violating the requirement repeatedly without showing improvements, that the farm will have to be accountable to impose fines or penalties or even terminate the business relations. And the just a little bit more in the microcosm of the farm, that the management practices ensure that visible or detectable non-compostable contaminants are removed from the piles through picking, screening, or other feasible practices. And then here, going deeper into sort of the whole complex around consolidation of food waste management streams, we're suggesting here that farms shouldn't be allowed to also accept slurries from the packaging facilities, knowing that per definition of ANR, a slurry is the end product of a non-source separated material that's been managed with that technology. So we're saying it's basically inherent that those slurries bear a greater risk for contaminants. So suggesting in this rule that those materials shouldn't be managed on farms. And that's kind of the explanation there. And then further down it says, although the land application of those slurries should not be is prohibited. And it says farms knowingly accepting slurries can also be subject to fines and criminal prosecution if they violate this provision. And then the question is, of course, okay, if slurries are the end product of materials that haven't been source separated, what if depackagers as of technology also just basically screen presumably source separated materials, and what is the end product of that? And so here we're suggesting basically a conversation starter with a proposed compromise, so to speak, to say, well, there can be like a special permit for farms to accept those, but they have to be analyzed for inert human-made contaminants greater than 1 millimeter. That's language we were borrowing from ANR, and also don't not to allow for materials that from haulers or generators that were reported in the past to have contaminated loads. So to speak, to rule out relationship with bad actors. I think that's the last piece of the suggested best practices.
Yep. And so a note on best practices and their place in rules. So there is also guidance. And so the rules, we want to be sure that we're saying things like have a system for this, but not saying what that system needs to be, because as soon as that is named in a rule, then that has to be regulated for. And so I was just having a conversation with a farmer that I work with on his composting system, and sort of like teasing apart the idea of rules versus guidance. And I do know from Dave and Zach that the Agency of Agriculture is intending on putting out guidance that will supplement the rules, including images and plans for, meaning like layouts of different types of on-farm composting systems. And so we're trying to, within these rules, we're trying to hit the higher level points of saying, like, these are things that need to be thought of, but not saying you have to do it in this way. Because, and then some of that might end up in guidance, but we also want to be sure that we're not overly prescriptive within the rules, which might then ultimately end up being a limiting factor for this practice. Any questions, or are people just eager to fill out the form and get access and start making suggestions? We're really hoping to get robust feedback from folks, and really it is an open invitation. And as well, and you'll see this throughout our version of the RAPs, that this is also an opportunity to look at all of them if they're opening it back up. And so if you, in your individual work, relate to different sections that maybe we didn't really comment on within the RAPs, please feel invited as well to add comments or suggestions or questions in, throughout this document. Even if we, within the core group of the Food Cycle Coalition, seemingly ignored it, like that, we were just trying to focus on the composting rules. But my understanding from Dave and Zach is that, this is opening up the RAPs in full again when they go into rulemaking. So if you have a pet peeve that's been bugging you for the last 5 years or however long it's been, this is also an opportunity to get out ahead of it and make proactive suggestions or recommendations for the agency to consider in their formal rulemaking process. Well, thank you all. I hope this is added clarity to what we've been up to, and I really look forward to hearing your feedback. And I will just end with saying that if the Google Drive environment is not your cup of tea, please reach out to me directly, and I can send you a Word doc version of this, and you can work with track changes on, and I will take the responsibility of integrating that. Or if you want to just look at it and email me general thoughts, that is very welcome also. And so we're trying to address and break down as many barriers for engagement as we can. So whatever works, please, my door is open. Feel free to pick up the phone and give a call or send me an email, and we'll figure something out. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time out of your days. Lovely to see some of you again who I haven't seen for quite a while. Yeah, I really look forward to engaging on this and hosting some of these future conversations with the Agency of Agriculture staff.
Very good. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha. Bye-bye, everybody.